Hello everyone, it is Randy. Back with another video. Today we are going to explore what I consider quite an important question, which is what is news? So over the next period of time, as we explore this issue together, this will be an uninterrupted, unedited video. We're going to explore this issue, and we're going to try to understand what is news together in a philosophical and analytical manner. So I was having a conversation with a friend who's a journalist, and I asked him the question, what is news, right? Fundamentally, what is it? He gave me a quite an interesting answer, which is news is the first draft of history. I thought that was a very eloquent way of putting it. News is the first draft of history. And that sort of makes sense from perhaps a historic perspective, in that you start with news, but perhaps, at least traditionally, it would show up in a newspaper, then it would be condensed maybe a couple weeks or a couple months later into a magazine story, and eventually it makes it into the hardcover books, and that becomes history. The medium itself also becomes more and more permanent, from the more disposable newspaper to the slightly more hardy magazine to eventually the hard-covered book, the permanent condensation of this information into a news item. So that was a very cool definition. But I think there's a bit more going on, especially in today's day, right? It's 2025, and it's very confusing what news even is. And there are a number of factors in play. One, obviously, is the rise of social media and user-generated news. There is the issue of fake news and AI-generated news. There is this trend that we've been seeing for many years, which is the decline of legacy media. So newspapers, TV, radio, we're seeing a decline of these media sources. So the channels of news, they're changing, right? So there are very few, if any, newspaper stands left in a city like mine, in Toronto, and many places in the world. I doubt you'll see many newspaper stands. People are accessing news differently. Fewer people are using TVs. Fewer people are watching TVs. The older generation may be watching TVs, but the younger generation, they're streaming. They're on their apps. They're using TikTok, YouTube. All right. So it's people are changing the way that they access information, and there's all these changes going on, as well as to what is considered newsworthy, right? Because in the past you had more curated news through TV, radio, newspapers. At least there was some screening mechanism that some body of people or organization decided that this information that was being fed to you was newsworthy. But now that's all changed. I don't even know what is newsworthy. What we're receiving on our apps, on our phones, what is perhaps considered news by some and perhaps junk by others. Is that newsworthy? So these are big questions. There's a lot of questions, and maybe not that many answers. But today we're going to try to get some answers. So let's start with perhaps my definition of news, and I've been thinking about this a lot. So what is news? Well, first of all, embedded in the word news is the word new. So I think at the very minimum, whatever it is, it has to be new or new-ish, right? The Second World War is not news. I mean, it's history, it's relevant, it's very important, but it's not news. The pandemic, right? The great pandemic of 2020, that's not news anymore. It was very important news at the time, but it's no longer news. It's information, it's historic, it's certainly very relevant, But it's not new. I mean, obviously, things that arose out of the pandemic may still be new, but the pandemic itself is no longer new. So it's not news, not in that traditional sense, anyways. So new, it has to be new, and then the second piece is it has to be at least somewhat relevant, right? And this is debatable. What is newsworthy and what is not newsworthy? Relevance is important. For example, if I change my shirt and I'm wearing a red shirt, is that newsworthy? Probably not, right? It's information. It's probably not newsworthy. It's probably not going to be very relevant to you, whether I'm wearing a red shirt or whether you're wearing a red shirt. That may not be very newsworthy. But if a war has broken out somewhere in the world, or there's a large pandemic or natural disasters or big political shifts, that may be newsworthy because it's relevant to a large number of people. So I think embedded in the definition of news is the sense that the information has to be relevant, at least to some people, because there's local news and international news. But it has to be relevant to at least some people, and newsworthy. So I think that's a fundamental part of this definition. As well, I think news, it has to be information that comes from a source that is not you. So what I mean by that is it has to be communicated to you through a different source, right? So if you discover something yourself, I wouldn't consider that news. News has to be heard or read. Like if I go outside and I see, a sinkhole on my street, right? That when I observe that sinkhole, that is not news. If I now tell my neighbor there is a sinkhole, that is news. From the neighbor's perspective, he or she has her news. If I tell my local newspaper there's a sinkhole on the street and they report on it, and now the community is aware of the sinkhole, that is news. But when I first discover the sinkhole, the primary source of me and that interaction, I'm not too sure that is news. And this has actually some interesting implications as to what news is, because again, it has to come from somewhere else, another person, another source. Nowadays, just algorithms or AI. It has to come from somewhere else. It's received. So that's actually an interesting component that I think has implications as to what is news and what is not, because your daily life, the experience of your daily life is not by most standards considered news, but once you tell other people or it's relevant to other people and they perceive it or receive it, that may become news. So keep that in mind. All right, so those are the components of news. I'm sure there are other components as well, but I guess fundamentally as well, there's one other component I may be missing, which is that at its core, news is information, right? News is information. That's, an object is not news, right? News is an informational thing. So at the core, it's information, and ideally, and this is where I'm editorializing a bit, ideally it should be information that helps you make better decisions. That's my opinion as to the type of information it should be. It should be information that helps you make better decisions in life. That's not always the case, especially with modern news and the sources of news that we now see being very prominent. But yeah, so if I were to summarize, what is news? News, it has to be information, right? At its very core, it has to be information. Number two, it has to be new or newish. It has to be novel to some extent. We usually don't consider historic facts or tried and true things that we find in our textbooks or that are taught in school through textbooks, for example, sort of condensed knowledge. We don't consider that to be news. That could be education, that could be something else, or history, but it's not news. There's that novelty and new factor I think is very important. It has to come from a source that's not you. Right, it could be your neighbor, it could be a newspaper, it could be a magazine, an app, a video, but it's coming from a source that's not you, and it should have some element of relevancy. right? That the information is not mundane or trivial. It should ideally be something that is relevant to your life. Okay, so keeping that in mind, the best way to maybe observe or analyze the current news landscape in today's modern society is perhaps to go back in time first, and to understand in a state of nature, maybe not even a state of nature, in a state of sort of an older time, what news would have looked like. And this is what I imagine it would have looked like. So humans, as you know, lived in villages, in small communities, long before we lived in cities, long before we had newspapers and TV and apps and TikTok and YouTube and streaming and Netflix and all of this stuff, right? We lived in villages that were pretty simple. And there were, I would imagine, two types of information that would have been very important to humans living in these small communities thousands of years ago. One is information related to the environment, right? And that could be the social environment, the geographic environment, the sort of large outside forces. For example, a war has broken out, right? And maybe there's an invading force that's coming close to your village. That would be news, right? The neighbors would be talking about it. People from other places may provide that information to you that, oh my God, there's an invading force coming, right? There's a disease, perhaps in a neighboring community, it's spreading, right? That would be news, a bubonic plague, right? A disease, a plague, a pestilence, a pandemic. Natural disasters, Mount Vesuvius just erupted. There's ash flying all over the place. There's a tsunami, a mudslide, an earthquake, or whatever the ancient people would have attributed that to, probably divine forces, right? Gods, and but nevertheless, the phenomenon would have occurred. So that would have been a concern, right? So wars, natural disasters, diseases. Perhaps even political changes, right? A new king, a new empire, the rise and fall of empires and political powers, that would have been considered news. So these are sort of environmental, large-scale items that ancient people would have been very interested in, because it would have been relevant. If an invading army was coming close to your community, your town, your village, your city, that would have been very relevant. If people were dying by way of a flood, and the flood was coming towards you and you have to move, that would have been relevant. These would have been large international, well, that's a modern term, international, but environmental, large, circumstantial, big item things that I think even for ancient humans would have been very, very relevant. And then there's the stuff that happens within your society, right? That's not, I would say, environmental in sort of my definition of these big social, political, environmental, natural disaster type items. But then there's things happening within your own community that is also perhaps very relevant to you. Who's dating who, for example, right? That's big news, gossip and rumor within your own community. Who's dying? Who's dead? Who just passed away? Who are the new people who are born? Right? Who just had kids? Right? Who's stealing from whom? Right? Crime. That's what we call crime. Who murdered who? That's relevant back then and relevant now. Who is getting into a dispute with whom? And I'm probably using who and whom interchangeably, so excuse my grammar here. But who is getting into a dispute? Right? Disputes. We're very attracted to disputes between people. It's almost innate that we're very attracted to news of conflicts and disputes. That's relevant within the community. Who's fighting with who doesn't like, whom, which neighbor doesn't like which neighbor, who's fighting over territory, property, whatever. And the news items, these are sort of like, I guess, more local, small time news items that nowadays has almost become, sort of, it's morphed into like celebrity watching and celebrity worship, parasocial relationships. I'm going to get into that in a second, because in our own communities, we're we may not be aware of who's dating who in our own communities, but we're aware of which celebrities are dating which celebrities, right? So I'm going to get into that, but it's morphed into sort of these parasocial relationships. But primarily, within your own community, social bonds, who's dating who's dying, who's committing crime, who's committing socially deviant behavior and misconduct, who's getting into conflict with whom within your own community. That's actually really relevant. Within communities, within ancient societies, even within small tribes, if you go further back in history, and perhaps even relevant within like primate communities, right? If we're talking about primatology and like looking at groups of apes and chimpanzees, like, they need to know in terms of determining hierarchy within their communities, who's linked to whom, right? Who's partnering with which ape, which apes are vulnerable, which apes are dying, which apes are more trustworthy. I'm sure within primate societies there is some element of this as well. So taking that as the background, right? So do we have large environmental issues that would be considered news, and sort of local, more social dynamic issues that would be considered news. What does that look like in modern times? Well, the large international circumstantial stuff, that's still very, very relevant, right? If you look at news today, what's happening in the stock market, right? Big movements in the stock market, right? It's financial news. That's relevant to a lot of people. Big political news, who won the election, which leader just won and became the leader of whatever country, that's relevant. What those leaders are doing, right? Everybody is, these days they're talking about Donald Trump, what he's doing, his decisions, that's relevant, right? His decisions, which countries are going to war with each other, that's relevant. If there are diseases and pandemics happening in the world, that's relevant, that's news. Natural disasters, everything I said about ancient societies that would have been considered newsworthy for them, in terms of foreign armies and natural disasters and big political decisions, that is still relevant to us now. I don't think that's changed so much, in that, you can see parallels. Obviously, the way that news was transmitted to ancient people was very different. It was probably word of mouth, right? Some local town crier would say, "Oh my God, there's a foreign army, coming, defend the city." But nowadays we get it on our phones, or we get an alert if there's a war that breaks out. So the communication of the news and how it's communicated, obviously that's very different now. But fundamentally, still, the environmental big items, they're the same, but it's a matter of scale, right? It's a matter of scale in the sense that now the items may be a lot larger and they're further away, because now we know what's happening in India, in Ukraine, in Brazil, in the US, in Australia, right? Back in the day, the news maybe didn't travel as quickly. But it's still the right analogy in that we're concerned about things that are happening around us that may affect us in some way. And then two, within our own community, this has morphed into, so all the concerns we had within the community, right? Who's dating who's engaging in misconduct, who's in conflict with who, that's morphed into one, sort of this obsession with celebrities and celebrity tabloid news, like which celebrity is dating which other celebrity, who's sleeping with who, other people's bedroom antics, and like sex life has become really, really relevant, even though we don't know these people. So this is a reflection of how we've formed and developed our societies, right? We don't have those neighborhood ties anymore, ties to a small community of people living in the same geographic region. We feel perhaps even more connected with people living in Los Angeles than we do with people living next door, right? We know more about certain celebrities, about their lives, their dating history, than people next door. So it's the way that we formed societies, in that now we have very large societies where we feel, and we have very limited connection with people who are physically next to us, and perhaps a much stronger emotional parasocial relationship with people who are very far away from us. So I think the who's dating who village rumor stuff has morphed into these parasocial relationships of celebrity gossip and celebrity worship, and as one commentator wrote, stargazing, right? That's what they called celebrity observation, stargazing, nice, gazing at the stars. So it's a cute term. The other elements within your own society, right, newsworthy, like who's engaging in misconduct, that's turned into this plethora of crime news. Crime is such a central element of the news, especially local news. And sometimes if it's a very big crime or a very juicy crime, it becomes international news as well. We're all very obsessed with crime, right? Who in our society is a deviant? Who's stealing, who's murdering, who's engaging in sexual assault, who's bribing, who's corrupt, who's engaged in armed robbery or whatever. I mean, the list of crimes go on, but murder, right? That's a very big one. That everybody wants to know who's been arrested for murder and who's been murdered, or who just died from homicide. That seems to be a very topical news item I think in most countries and in most communities, or crime is just so central, and there's an entire industry of crime news, and then documentaries about crime and real crime, and we're obsessed with and we don't know these people, right? That back in the day when we lived in smaller communities, if we've discovered someone engaged in crime, or someone was a victim of crime, that was maybe even more relevant to us, because we knew these people, or we knew someone who knew these people. But in larger societies, in modern societies, someone engaging in crime in the city, is that really relevant? We know crime is happening. In larger societies, inevitably crime will happen, but how relevant is it? But we get inundated with all this news about crime, right? Disputes. We talked about disputes. Back in the day, it would be like, who's having a fight with who in your neighborhood. That would have been juicy gossip and juicy information. Nowadays, it's lawsuits, right? Like which company is suing which other company, which two celebrities are suing each other, who's getting into a dispute, like Taylor Swift and Kanye West have beef, right? That's we're interested in fights. We're aware of people who don't like each other from far away. Probably even more so than people who don't like each other within our own social circle. We're probably more in tune with that. So again, this has shifted. Our need to understand and observe and record conflicts between people, that's certainly shifted as well. And I'll add that back in the day, sort of the salacious stuff, right? Who's having an affair, right? That type of thing was obviously within one's own community. Like that particular person is having an affair with that person, right? That would have been within one's own community. You would want to observe or receive that news. Nowadays, it has become international, and we're obsessed with certain strangers who engage in these types of transgressions. A big example recently is Andy Byron, who was discovered to be cheating on his wife at a Coldplay concert with his head of HR. He was a CEO at this company called Astronomer. He's since resigned. But it was big international news. Right, international news, and it was all over social media. Like, essentially, it was just a guy cheating on his wife, right? like, is that all that newsworthy? But it's international news, right? It's like literally this is the personal decision of one man, right? And how it affects his family, and that's just his business. But it became international news. Like, so this particular incident with Andy Byron and the cheating scandal with the Coldplay cam that caught him cheating in public at a Coldplay concert. This particular incident has blown up internationally. Like, everybody is talking about it. So back in the day in the village, it would just be small groups of people saying, hey, this person slept with that person, but now we know the secret sex lives of strangers we've never even met, and we comment on their conduct, and it's like this collective experience. It's very bizarre, but these are sort of the parasocial relationships that we're now forming with strangers and people we don't know, and that's more or less replaced the town square, the news you get in the village, the rumor mill within your own community that ancient communities and historic communities used to have. But now it's all parasocial relationships. People doing things far away that we for some reason find to be very juicy and relevant. So that's sort of the analogy I'm drawing in again, ancient societies versus modern societies in terms of news and what that news looks like. So what are some of the challenges now in terms of what is actually news, right? And what's relevant, because right now in our world we get so much information. We get so much information from all different types of sources, and especially with self-made news, self-published news from social media. You see this sort of dangerous trend where we can't even decipher what is news, and that's not even to mention sort of fake news and artificially intelligently generated fake news that's not even truth, right? That's a completely different phenomenon where now we have to decipher what's true versus what is just fake. But let's start with the earlier phenomenon, which is really one of relevancy. This is to say that we're having trouble understanding, or we were for the long time, with the rise of social media and different news sources, we were having trouble as a society understanding what's relevant. So again, historically, you had news was sort of controlled by large sources, right? Newspapers, TV, radio. Yes, there was more control over the news. So the consequence of that was obviously certain news maybe did not get to you, or perhaps certain governments or political forces or organizations could control the sources of the news and therefore control how what you received, right? What you read. So you think of this in authoritarian governments where the control of the media was a way to then control people and through propaganda and the news that they receive. So obviously that's a consequence. But barring that type of situation, I'll just say in democratic societies, right? I'm not here to editorialize sort of politics today, but let's say in democratic societies where news was predominantly meant to educate or to inform, and not meant as a way to engage in or spread propaganda. Let's just make that assumption. That's not always true, obviously, but let's make that assumption for today's video, that in Western democratic societies, predominantly the news was not propaganda, although there's a lot of advertising, which is a propaganda in a way. But I digress. You understand what I'm trying to say. So through these news outlets, there was at least some level of filtering that, if things were irrelevant or not newsworthy or just trite and very pedestrian or just entertainment, it would not have made it to the 10 o'clock news on TV, right? So I remember watching the 10 o'clock CBC news, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. This was my daily ritual for many years with Peter Mansbridge. You'd watch it with the family. The 10 o'clock news was considered ritual. You'd want to watch, I think it was 10 o'clock, it was a long time ago, but it was considered ritual. You'd want to watch the news, and this is how you got your daily dose of high quality information. And there were certain newspapers that I enjoyed, the Globe and Mail, Toronto Star. These were newspapers, at least growing up in Toronto, that I really enjoyed, and I had often bought or had subscriptions to these newspapers that I consider very important, that they had relevant news. And one of the central elements of that news consumption was this idea of trust, that you could trust that this was relevant to you and that this was newsworthy, right? Now you allocated that trust to the companies, the publishers, really, of the newspapers, the publishers of the TV programs and the radio programs. So you had allocated that trust and assigned, maybe assigned is the better word, assigned that trust to these organizations to have your best interests at heart as the general public. And that these publishers and organizations would give you the best and most relevant news, right? So there was that sort of social contract, if you will, between the general public, the news-consuming public, and the producers of news items. That at the heart of it was relevance, importance, and that these were sort of curated and at least customized and filtered in some way. With the rise of social media, we started to notice some interesting phenomenon, right? So, user-generated news and the way that news was shared. Now news was more, as some people say, democratic, but then it also became really scattered. Then legacy media started to, at one point, I remember a couple years ago, they started to quote Twitter. Twitter is X now, but they started to quote Twitter. Like suddenly social media started to make its way into traditional news stories. And that's when I knew it was the end, right? When the Toronto Star and Globe and Mail and CBC were starting to just quote random Twitter comments from user-generated content, that was I think the beginning of the end, right? All right, of sort of this old model of sort of higher quality curated news. But when they started getting their sources and getting their quotes from just the general public, who were just, their sentiments of the general public through Twitter and through Facebook, that was the beginning of the end, because it showed that these news sources were losing their control. And now we call them legacy media. They've completely lost their control because nobody even accesses. Very few people now access these sources of media for their news consumption. So they started quoting Twitter, and then due to fights with Google and fights with search engines, they started to put all of their items behind paywalls. Right, so back in the day, you could still access a lot of news items from Google News and search engines and aggregators. But then these news publishers, they wanted to get paid for their news, so they put all the news behind their paywalls, essentially asking for users to pay subscriptions to access these news items. And compared to free sources, most users on the internet, which by now was the primary way that people were accessing news through their apps or through phones or through their computers, as opposed to TV, radio, newspapers, these traditional ways that started to die out. Most people just were not very interested in paying subscriptions, right? They were not interested in paying for news. They would rather get news for free. So legacy media went through this sort of death spiral. In one, again, they were beholden to sort of social media and new ways of generating news and new media and search engines and like it was a very complex ecosystem. But you get what I'm trying to say. That the environment started to change. So legacy media took a backseat. And people don't really subscribe to legacy media anymore. I mean, I have a subscription to The Economist, which I think is very relevant and newsworthy, and it's very high quality. So I still pay for The Economist, but I wouldn't pay for Globe and Mail. I wouldn't pay for Toronto Star. I wouldn't pay for, I just wouldn't. Now Toronto Star and Globe and Mail, some of the news sources that I used to enjoy, they're behind paywalls, right? So you can't even access their stories. Maybe one or two you can access for free per month, but you can't access their stories now. So therefore, I'm not accessing their stories. And probably the majority of people in Canada are not accessing their stories anymore. And probably in different countries, the news sources behind paywalls, probably most people in those countries, in the U.S. and in England, they're probably not accessing information, news items behind paywalls because there are other sources of news. So that's where the death spiral keeps spiraling and legacy media keeps getting less and less relevant as they try to protect themselves. But with the death of legacy media, TV, radio, newspapers, and with the rise of social media and new ways of receiving information, one thing started to die, which was the curated, customized, not customized, but the curated, vetted, maybe that's the better word, the vetted news items that you would receive as the general public. Right? Social media is not vetted at all. Right? Anybody could generate news or news items on social media. So with the lack of vetted content, we now live in a world where there is all of this information generated by users, generated by small organizations, generated by individuals. It's flooding the internet. And without that central organizations to vet what's important and relevant, it's very difficult to tell what is important and relevant. Nowadays, most of the news that most people say that they get their news from social media, right? From Instagram, from Facebook, and added to the problem is that due to government conflict with some of these social media giants. For example, in Canada, you can't even get news on Facebook or Instagram because the publishers got into a fight with the social media companies, and they asked the social media companies to remit certain fees to the publishers, these legacy media publishers, and the social media companies like Meta, Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg. They just said, we're just going to remove news items from our platforms in Canada altogether. I think this is a uniquely Canadian thing. But you can't actually get news, not what we would consider traditional news on Facebook or Instagram in Canada. So the population is becoming more and more dumb and less news literate by the day. So where are people getting their information? Well, it's through, I guess, social media, through TikTok or YouTube, your feeds on X and Twitter. Right, this is where a lot of people are getting their news now, through their social media feeds, and a lot of it's not news. So I guess that's where I started with the definition of what is news and what's not news. I think the information, it is still information, but I don't think a lot of it is newsworthy anymore. See, again, with the death of legacy media and the lack of sort of vetted, relevant information, now we just have information. It's information that in many cases is perhaps disguised as news, in that it's new and novel and perhaps entertaining and it captures your attention, doubled by the fact that the algorithms used by social media platforms feed you information that you like to consume, right? The algorithms give you more of what you're already consuming. So now you have just information you want to consume, whereas you're sort of blind to the outside world, to other types of information. So now you just get information. So now information is one of the, remember at the beginning of the video, we talked about what is news and what is not news, right? It has to come from a source that is not you. So that criteria, check, that's satisfied. It's coming from other sources. It is information. That's check. It is information. It is new in that it's novel, in that it's happening now. Check. But is it newsworthy, right? Remember the other criteria of the four criteria that I mentioned. Newsworthy. Is it actually relevant? Nowadays, I feel the news on social media that most people are getting, because that's their primary source of news, that's almost like I've changed my shirt to red, right? Remember, I talked about that earlier in the video. If I've changed my shirt to red, is that newsworthy? It's information. It's new, it's happening, and maybe you hear about it from somewhere. So 3 criteria have been satisfied, but the 4th criteria, relevance, like actual relevance, is I think lacking. So you will know now that I changed my shirt to a red shirt on social media. But how is that really relevant to you? And this goes to a statement I made earlier, which I'm going to repeat, and this is my opinion, that news fundamentally, really at the end of the day, should help you make better decisions, right? So the environmental stuff, right? The wars, the natural disasters, the political changes, that news, and also the news along with what's happening within your community, the crime, who's sleeping with who fights with who's dead, who's dying, who's born, like all of this stuff, all of this new information. At the end of the day, I think ultimately from the personal subjective reality perspective of you as the individual, what is all of this information? What does that do? What is the purpose of news and this information? Is, well, to help you make better decisions in life, right? Either through education, right? So something's happening, so you need to make these choices, or through the fact that this, I guess, maybe education, knowledge, wisdom. Help me out here, but it's supposed to ideally make you more knowledgeable, more wise, and help you make better decisions in life, or help you understand things in better light, or the things that are happening around you, right? So I think at a deeper level, it's supposed to assist you in decision making in some way. But the so-called news, and it's barely news these days, it's more just junk information, a lot of it, that is disguised as news, right? So disguised news. Does that really help you make better decisions? But we're inundated with it. So pause there. Think about that. The news that you receive, or what you perceive as news, does that help you make better decisions in your day-to-day life? I was talking to a friend recently, and I asked him, do you read the news at all? Do you and he says, no, I completely ignore the news. And he's a very smart guy. He's a financial advisor. He completely ignores the news, and he says, I will research things relevant to my field. So, financial advice information or education or new developments in the financial advice world, so I can educate and better serve my clients. But outside of that, I'm not remotely concerned with what's happening in the world. And that's what he said to me. He's very insulated in the type of information he wants to consume, which is good. He's a very disciplined person, very intelligent person, and he's very focused. So I guess it helps with distraction, right? With removing distraction if you're just focused on what's relevant to your profession. Obviously, I feel, my personal opinion is that there's a lot going on outside of your own profession that's relevant to you or to your family or to your community, right? So as a lawyer, if I only focused on legal news, what's happening in the law or developments in the law, I think I would be very insular and single-minded. It would just be I'm using this as a term of art, a monoculture of information, right? You know how you can have a monocrop, like you're just growing corn, and that's just corn, and there's nothing else. It's not diverse. I think there would just be a monoculture of information here for me, and I don't think that's healthy. I think knowing things outside of your own profession, knowing things outside of your immediate community, is actually really, really relevant. So I don't really subscribe to his very extreme approach, which is like, I don't read the news at all. I don't consume the news. I don't want to be distracted by it. I'm only interested in things that are directly relevant to my business, to my profession, and how I can serve my clients, right? So I don't quite subscribe to that. But the problem is, with all the information that's out there that you're receiving, how do you filter? I think that's where we're going to sort of conclude this video, which is the filtering. How do you get high quality information? Because again, on top of just the low quality scattering of information, you're also dealing with, in our modern era, fake news, right? Fake information created by AI or created by people that's just not true. is just false. So you don't really make good decisions when you get false information or propaganda or incorrect information. That's probably the antithesis of making good decisions, when you're operating on false information or information that is so, that deviates so much from the truth that you're making actually the wrong decisions, whether it's the wrong health decisions, wrong political choices, the wrong personal choices, your interpretation of the world. You get further away from the truth, which I don't think is very healthy and very productive. So we're dealing with a lot of user-generated news and lack of vetting. So that's a huge phenomenon. The death of legacy media, the tsunami of information, right? The sheer amount, the volume of information, the overwhelming volume that you have to sift through to figure out what's relevant, plus fake news, plus stuff that's just not true. So in today's world, being media literate and news literate, I think is more important than ever, in that you have to critically analyze almost every piece of information that you see, which is really tiring. It causes just information fatigue, and I feel that information fatigue. It's just so much, and so much of it is not relevant, and so much of it may not be true. It's like the information nowadays. It's like the grocery stores where you walk in to like Walmart, and most of the food is junk, right? Preserved junk food, chips and Coca-Cola, and frozen chicken nuggets, and preserved pickles, and I don't know, just canned stuff, with a small fresh fruit and vegetable section that's organic, and that's like the real stuff. Whereas 98% of the grocery store, and you walk into the United States, you go to a Target and you try to buy like fresh oranges. There's like a small section for fresh oranges and maybe one or two pieces of broccoli, and the rest of the grocery store is just canned food and frozen food and preserved food, and candy and sugar, and we recognize that causes obesity, right, and cancer and health effects. But I think something similar is happening for information. That most of the information is junk. Not all the information, but most of it that is glossy and attractive, that we may gravitate towards, or that we find in our face, right? That is most prominent, and that is most like in your face. Most of that's junk. Like you have junk food, and then you have junk information. So I think most of the information now is junk, and it becomes so important to filter and to find essentially the news version or the information version of organic fruit and vegetables, right? So I'm going to say that again because I think it's a cute sentence, to find the news version of organic fruits and vegetables. And that differs from person to person. Again, I've mentioned The Economist. I love reading The Economist. I think that's a high quality, one of the last high quality newspapers out there that really synthesizes a lot of global events and presents it in a meaningful, relevant way. So, and for you, it could be something else, right? There are certain YouTube series that, certain podcasts I think that are very educational, that could be considered news, in that they're dealing with relevant contemporary issues. But you really have to sift through sources. Right now, what do I use in my life to help me make better decisions? I find BBC is really, really good. I start my day usually with some BBC. I still think that, obviously BBC has their issues, but they're still, their coverage and their international coverage, I think, is still better than a lot of other news sources. I usually like to go to several news sources now just to cross-reference. So if I want an international perspective, I will, start with BBC. I will look at some of the American news channels like CNN and maybe MSNBC, just to take a look at the American perspective, because different perspectives are important. I would take a look at DW, which is German, and France 24, which is French, just to get some supplements in terms of the European perspective. I'll look at Al Jazeera as well, just to get a Middle East perspective. All of these sources, right? Every source I mentioned, they're all biased, right? Bias is inherent in all of these news sources. But once you read several news sources and you understand they're all biased, and you consolidate and you synthesize all the information, it becomes a little bit better, right? Once you read 10 biased sources critically and understanding that they're biased, at least you have a better understanding of the truth. So Al Jazeera, I will read. I'll read some sources from China as well. I may on occasion read Russian sources, RT News, just to get the Russian perspective on things. Again, it's biased. Absolutely it is biased. But it's important, I think, also to get that perspective, and not to completely ignore one particular perspective because it is biased, as long as you know that it is biased, right? On occasion, I may look at some Latin American and South American sources just to see what's going on in that part of the world. I'll look at ABC, which is the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, and then CBC, Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. I'll look at ABC, CBC, just to round it up with some Canadian and Australian news sources. So this gives me, and then add The Economist on top of this. This gives me a good sense of what's going on in the world, which I think is important to me to understand what's going on in the world. But I certainly will not just look at one source. I think looking at one source is no longer a good option. Google News used to be really good. It's become less good because I think a lot of the good publishers put their content behind paywalls. So now I get a lot of junk on Google News. I get lots of crypto-related news now on Google News, and kind of second-rate financial news items. So I still look at it on occasion, and it's somewhat relevant, but it's not my main source now, and I don't think it's even good to have a main source, because it's really important now to actively hunt for news. If you're really looking for the truth and you're really looking for things that are relevant, to really hunt for good sources and different sources and to amalgamate these sources. And that takes time and energy, right? It takes time and energy to do that, but what choice do you have? If you want the truth, if you want to make better decisions in life, then you're going to have to look at different sources. And then you also want to look at different types of news, right? Financial news, you want to look at that. You want to look at science news, right? To be a really well-rounded, well-educated person. So I guess inherently, if I were to summarize, understanding the different biases within the sources that you are accessing is important, that they're all biased. So just go in with a grain of salt. Access multiple sources, so that you're not only filtering your information through one bias. Try to actively hunt for news rather than passively receiving it. Receiving it through social media is passive, and I don't think that's the best, because the algorithms will just give you the type of stuff that you like to click on, and very soon it just becomes entertainment, right? Trying to get your information from social media, you go down the rabbit hole of it just becomes entertainment. It just becomes the stuff that the masses, the great majority of people, they want to click on, right? It's just, that's what you end up getting. And most of it is junk information, right? It's the junk food information that I talked about earlier. So I think that's it. I think hunt for news, be critical, go to multiple sources, choose a couple sources that you really like or that's relevant, and try to avoid the junk stuff. And that's how you can eat your organic fruits and vegetables from a news perspective, and stay healthy in terms of your information, and be very critical of fake news as well. You always want to cross-reference. I know it takes a lot of time, right, to have to cross-reference things. If I read something that smells a little bit fake, I now actively cross-reference. I'll research other sources to assess its credibility. So essentially, you have to be your own investigative journalist in today's world to be really on top of things, to have good news, relevant news, real news. That's the world we live in. But if you're active and you take these steps and you're media literate, you will be better informed than the general public, and that will help you make better decisions. This is Randy I. I'm promoting good news literacy, a good healthy diet of news, and I'm promoting the fact that you should make better decisions with the information that you receive. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to like and subscribe for similar content in the future, and have an amazing day. I'll see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.